Hello, welcome to another lesson with Professor Choi. I have a lot of students that ask me this question all the time. What is the difference between communism, capitalism, and socialism? And there's a confusion out there about are they types of governments or are they economic philosophies? And they're not types of governments, they're philosophies. They're ways of thinking about how we should distribute the resources in society. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over some of those examples of governments and what are the differences basically between socialism, capitalism, and communism. All right, so first let's start with economic philosophies. So economic philosophies are basically ways of thinking about how to distribute the economic resources of society. In economics, we have four resources. We call them land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So basically, it's a basic question of who should be the owner of land, how should we control labor, how do we distribute capital, and entrepreneurship. So should we have the entrepreneurs control their own knowledge and the things that they come up with, or should the government be the owner of those things? That's why things like capitalism, socialism, and communism are basically philosophies of how to address these questions. So they're considered economic and social philosophies basically on how to answer this question of the distribution of resources. Now, capitalism basically is a philosophy that says that the ownership of the resources should be private entities. In other words, labor resources should be controlled by the people. Private entities should control the rest of society. In other words, there should be private owners for land. There should be private owners for hospitals. There should be private owners for houses. There should be private owners for parks, etc., etc. Okay? So what it basically says is that industry should be controlled privately and most things should be privately controlled. We don't have such a thing as 100% capitalism, at least not in a modern society, in the way in which most of us think about it. Because every time you introduce some kind of government, and that government has a very large control over the resources of society, in the case of the United States, for example, 20 to 25% of expenses in the United States are from the government. That basically means that you don't really exist in a sort of pure capitalist society. You exist in a mostly capitalist society. Alright, now socialism is a type of philosophy where social ownership of and means of production should be instead social. In other words, the people should have as groups control of resources. So this is a sort of idea where you start seeing what we call cooperatives, where you got groups of people that control groups of resources instead. And those groups of people can be organized in several types of governments, but the idea of a socialistic society is that things should be controlled by groups or social groups, aka could be the government if you want, but they could be smaller governments. Think about villages and tribes or something of that sort. Okay? And they have all these different names for it. But basically, in a sort of socialism way, there is more social ownership of resources. Now, these two are basically competing philosophies. And what you normally see in today's societies is countries adapting sometimes one and sometimes the other. For example, in the United States we have Social Security. Social Security is a socialistic sort of idea, where people think, well, you know, for the purpose of old age, maybe we should have a common fund for people. Medicare is another sort of social idea, because it includes basically this group that pools the money for another group of people. Now, there is no major control of resources in any of those two. In other words, we don't really own land, we don't really own labor, etc., etc., etc. But these are quote-unquote socialistic ideas. Now, what exactly is communism? Now, communism is basically taking socialism to an extreme. So communism is basically the advocation for social class warfare. And this is a really extreme view of socialism. Now, what it basically says is that the government should control all resources because the government is a representative of society. In other words, people select the government, and therefore the government represents the people, and therefore the government should be the owner and controller of all the resources in society. So this is a really extreme way of looking at socialism. What it does though is it creates class warfare between basically the rich and the poor. Because in socialism, if all resources are distributed by the government, then basically there should be no rich and no poor. Everybody should be the same because the government should distribute the resources back equally. It advocates for complete government ownership of resources in a very basic way. Alright, now, why does these get confused with governments? Alright, I'm not quite sure. But usually when we start having a conversation, people start going, well, we live in a capitalist society. And then they don't quite understand that you can't really call the government in the United States capitalist. The government is the way the government runs itself. And this is a sort of philosophy of how to run or control the resources in society. So as it turns out, most governments have a little bit of each within their way of thinking. Alright, so let's take a look at some of that and sort of explain it in different ways. So, in the United States of America, we live under what is called a constitutional federal republic. Now let's break that down. What that basically means is that the rule of the government comes from the Constitution. That's why we put constitutional first. So the Constitution creates the government. Now the Constitution creates a federal republic. Republic basically means that each member of that group of the federal, in this case the states, are the ones that designate the rulers for that federal republic. Alright? Something key here that a lot of people don't quite understand, which is the reason why we have the voting system that we have in the US, where we select electoral representatives and we use the electoral vote to go and represent us at the federal level. So when each state votes for a president, you don't directly vote for the president. If that was so, then the electoral system would not be the one selecting the president. It will be the national total tally. It will be the national total vote, which we keep count of, by the way, but that's not the one that we use in order to select the president in the United States. Instead, the way it works is each person votes in their individual state, and then each state decides how to allocate their electoral votes. The electoral votes are the ones that each member of the federal republic take to then later to elect the leader. Okay? So, again, we live under a constitutional federal republic. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about China. The official name of China is the People's Republics of China. That's the official name of China. And the reason it's called the People's Republic of China is because China at some point had multitudes of parties. What basically happened in China is that the Communist Party has now taken over the government because they became basically the largest party, the gaining party, the one that took over. In the United States, we have also multitudes of parties with two major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that basically run the majority of government positions. But there are lots of other minor parties that you can join if you're not happy, by the way, with the Democratic or the Republican Party. Alright? Now what happened basically in China is the Communist Party at some point took over and they have been able to maintain control in multitudes of ways. Okay? Now it would be it will be difficult to basically say that this could be that or this could be that, but I do need you to understand that what China basically is what we call a single party system, where basically a political party has taken over the system, and then they have basically cemented power all over China to be able to maintain power. It's kind of like, imagine that either the Republican or the Democratic Party will take over the system, and then after that they were able to cement power all over the United States. That will be something similar. Now, of course, it would not be similar in the way you run the country, but it will be similar in the way you form it. Alright, Canada has a federal parliamentary democracy under a constitutional monarchy. So the way this works, it's really interesting, and if you're interested on learning a little bit more about this, I want you to later Google members of the Commonwealth. Because one of the things that happened was when the United Kingdom used to be a great nation with a lot of seafaring happening, they used to control lots of islands and countries. And eventually when they gave freedom to a lot of these places, what they basically did is they established local types of governments to rule the country, but they maintained some sort of control through what we call today the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is really run by the Queen. So in Canada, you have a federal parliamentary democracy under a constitutional monarchy, also known as the Commonwealth. And the Queen of the constitutional monarchy for the Commonwealth is Queen Elizabeth II. So inside of Canada, basically, you have a federal parliamentary democracy. But on top of that, you have what we call the constitutional monarchy, which means the Queen is the top power in those types of governments. The United Kingdom, of course, is also part of that Commonwealth. So they live under a parliamentary constitutional monarchy with Queen Elizabeth II at the top. Another country that you might be interested in learning about is Japan. And Japan, it's a parliamentary constitutional monarchy under Emperor Naruhito. Alright, now, again, to give you a bit of an idea of how social policies or capitalistic policies start changing a lot of the conversations. For example, let's talk about healthcare. In Japan, they have something called universal healthcare, which is very similar to where we are in right now in the United States. Universal healthcare is a system where everybody's sort of required to have healthcare, but it doesn't matter how you get it. So you could get it privately, you could get it publicly, or you could get it through any other way in which you could get healthcare. So the key though is that everybody should be covered in some way, either by the government providing you healthcare help or by you buying it by yourself or in some combination of those two. It's what we call universal healthcare. If you go to the United Kingdom, they have what we call socialized medicine. Now, the reason that it's called socialized medicine is basically because the United Kingdom has a healthcare service which is owned by the government and basically controlled by the government. Most doctors and people who work in the healthcare system in the United Kingdom called the National Health Service basically are government workers. So the system for healthcare, the majority of healthcare in the United Kingdom is basically socialized. It is controlled by the government. Alright? Now that does not mean, by the way, that private companies cannot exist. So you could also have private companies providing healthcare for things that the public government system does not provide. That's what they have in the United Kingdom. What do they have in Canada? In Canada, they have a system with this we call single payer system. Again, for healthcare. A single payer system is a system where you only have one insurance company. So it's a single payer system. Another way of thinking about this system, if you're in the United States and don't quite understand, is what we call Medicare for all. Which basically means that it will be a system where you pay taxes towards your insurance. The insurance will be something like Medicare, but for everyone, not for people over 65 only. Alright? Now what do we have in the United States? Well, in the United States we have something like universal health care, but not really, because there's still about, last time I checked, about 18 million people or so in the United States without health insurance. So in the United States we have a mostly privatized healthcare system with some social policies. A really good example of a socialized medical system existing within a private system is the Veteran Affairs in the United States. That is basically controlled by the federal government, and it provides health care for veterans, basically. But I need you to understand the majority of those hospitals and doctors and nurses and people who work for that system are all mostly government employees, which basically means that it is in fact socialized medicine, but only for a group of people in the United States. Alright? So, as you can see, this gets very confusing. If you're interested in learning more about this, I would recommend taking some classes. College classes are open to pretty much everyone, especially in your community college, and they will go into detail into a lot of this stuff to try to explain how it works. Thank you for tuning in to Professor Choi, and I hope you learned a little bit today. Have a good one.